before we begin, I need you to picture something. A field of poppies, white and purple petals catching the morning light, thousands of them swaying in a gentle wind somewhere in the ancient world. Papaver somniferum, the opium poppy, tall stalks crowned with delicate flowers, and beneath those flowers, bulbous seed pods. And if you were to take a blade and score one of those unripe pods at just the right moment, you would see something remarkable. A thick white latex would begin to weep from the wound. Within hours, exposed to air, it would oxidize into a brown resin. That resin contains morphine, codeine, thebaine, alkaloid that can erase pain, induce euphoria, and bring sleep so deep it feels like mercy. This is not a story about that flower. This is a story about what we did to it, what we made it become, how humanity took a plant that knew no malice, that grew indifferent to our politics and our greed, and transformed it into the justification for empires, for slavery, for wars that killed millions, and for a medical crisis that today kills over 100,000 Americans every single year. The flower is just a plant. The story is about us. Before we go any further, I want to ask something of you. If you're finding value in this content, if you appreciate the research and the care that goes into these deep dives into forgotten history, hit the like button. Subscribe if you haven't already. And in the comments, tell me where you're watching from and what time is right now. I love seeing this community span the globe. People settling in for sleep in Tokyo, while others are just waking in Sao Paulo. Phone away now. Distractions silenced. Because what I'm about to tell you is darker and stranger than the sanitized version you may have learned in school. This is 6,000 years of buried truth, of empires built on addiction, of wars fought to protect drug trafficking, of a flower that became a weapon, not because of what it was, but because of what we needed it to be. The opium poppy has been witness to some of humanity's greatest moral failures. It has never judged us. It has simply bloomed and bled and bloomed again. In the beginning, there was only relief, only mercy, only sleep. 6,000 years ago, long before the pyramids rose in Egypt, before the first cities appeared in Mesopotamia, before writing existed to record anything at all, humans were already cultivating a relationship with the opium poppy. The evidence comes from Neolithic lake dwellings, wooden stilted villages built over the water in what is now Switzerland and northern Italy. Archaeologists excavating these ancient settlement sites have found something remarkable. Charred poppy seeds, preserved in the archaeological record, silent testimony to humanity's oldest pharmaceutical partnership, Papaver somniferum, the sleep-bringing poppy. It is not difficult to identify, even for those with no botanical training. The plant grows tall, sometimes reaching 4 feet in height, with broad, deeply lobed leaves that have a distinctive blue-green hue, almost waxy in appearance. But it is the flower and the seed pod that define it. The petals could be white, purple, pink, or red, delicate as tissue paper, lasting only a few days before they fall away to reveal what lies beneath. The pod, bulbous, smooth, crowned with radiating star-like stigma at its apex. Beautiful in its architecture. Someone, somewhere in the deep past, made a discovery. Perhaps it was accidental. Perhaps it was born of curiosity or desperation. We will never know. But at some point, a person took a blade or a sharp stone and scored the surface of an unripe poppy pod, and they watched as a thick, milky white latex began to weep from a wound. It would have been sticky, viscous, and if left alone, it would oxidize overnight, turning from white to brown, from liquid to resin. This is opium in its rawest form. The technique for harvesting it has not changed in 6 millennia. You score the pod at dusk. You return at dawn. You scrape away the dried resin with a blade. You collect it, and then someone tasted it. What happened next must have seemed like magic. Within minutes, warmth would spread through the body. Pain, ever-present pain from injury or infection, or simply the brutal wear of Stone Age existence, would begin to dissolve. A sense of profound well-being would settle over the mind. Anxiety, fear, the constant alertness required to survive in a dangerous world, all of it would soften and fade. And then sleep would come. Not the fitful, half-aware sleep of exhaustion, but deep, restorative, dreamless oblivion. For Neolithic people, this was nothing short of divine intervention. Consider the context. These were not people with access to aspirin, to antibiotics, to anesthesia of any kind. A broken bone meant months of agony. An infected wound could mean death. Dental abscesses were common and excruciating. Childbirth was dangerous and intensely painful. There was no escape from physical suffering except endurance or this flower. The alkaloid responsible for opium's effects is morphine, which makes up roughly 10 to 15% of raw opium by weight. Morphine binds to opioid receptors in the human brain and spinal cord, interrupting pain signals and inducing euphoria. The ancient peoples did not understand the chemistry, but they understood the result. This was not recreational use. This was survival technology. The reverence with which early cultures treated the opium poppy suggests they understood its power and respected it. Poppy seeds have been found in burial sites, in ceremonial contexts, integrated into the fabric of ritual and medicine. The plant spread gradually across the Mediterranean world, carried by migrating peoples, by traders, by the slow expansion of agriculture. Wherever humans settled and began to cultivate the earth, the poppy followed. It was a gift, a mercy in a merciless world. As agriculture spread and civilizations rose along river valleys, the poppy traveled with them. The first written reference to opium appears in Sumerian cuneiform tablets dating back to approximately 3400 BC, carved into clay in the cities of Mesopotamia, where writing itself was being born. The Sumerians, who gave us the wheel, the plow, and the earliest known legal codes, had a name for the opium poppy. They called it Holgil, the plant of joy, not the plant of evil, not the plant of addiction, not the plant of moral corruption. Joy, that is what they saw in it. Relief from suffering, mercy in botanical form. This is where opium enters recorded history, and from this point forward, we can trace its journey with precision. The ancient Egyptians embraced opium with the same pragmatic wisdom. The Ebers Papyrus, a medical document dating to approximately 1500 BC and one of the oldest and most comprehensive medical texts to survive from the ancient world, contains over 700 remedies and prescriptions. Opium appears repeatedly throughout its pages. It was prescribed for pain, for severe diarrhea, for calming crying infants, and even for easing transition into death for those whose suffering had become unbearable. The Egyptians grew their opium near the city of Thebes, and Theban opium became renowned throughout the Mediterranean world for its potency and quality. It was a commodity, a medicine, a tool of the physician's trade. There was no stigma attached to its use, no moral panic, no laws forbidding it. The Greeks inherited this knowledge and expanded upon it. Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine, who lived from approximately 460 to 370 BC, wrote extensively about opium. He called it meconium, derived from the Greek word for poppy. He advocated its use for pain relief, for inducing sleep, and for treating a range of ailments from internal diseases to epidemics. But Hippocrates was not naive. His writings include warnings. He understood that opium, while extraordinarily useful, carried risks. Dependency could develop. Dosage mattered. It was a powerful tool that required respect and caution. This is a critical point. The ancients were not ignorant of opium's dangers. They simply weighed those dangers against the alternatives, which in most cases meant unrelieved agony or death, and they made a calculated choice. Greek physicians continued to refine opium preparations. A physician named Diagoras, working in the centuries after Hippocrates, is credited with creating an early form of opium tincture, dissolving the resin in wine to make it easier to dose and administer. This method would echo through the centuries, eventually evolving into the laudanum that would dominate European medicine 2 millennia later. But in the Greek world, it was simply medicine. Practical, effective, understood. Opium was integrated into the fabric of ancient medical practice across multiple civilizations. In Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in Greece, in Persia, physicians knew its properties. They understood its applications. They documented its effects with clinical precision. For more than 5,000 years, from the Neolithic period to the height of classical civilization, opium was treated as what it fundamentally is, a powerful analgesic derived from a plant. It saved lives. It eased suffering. It allowed people to endure pain that would otherwise have been unendurable. There were no drug wars fought over it, no empires built on its prohibition. No populations criminalized for using it. It was simply part of the pharmacopoeia, one tool among many in humanity's long struggle against pain and disease. The flower bloomed, the latex was harvested, the medicine was administered, and life, brutal as it was in the ancient world, became slightly more bearable. This equilibrium would hold for millennia, not because the ancients were more enlightened than we are, but because they had not yet discovered how to weaponize medicine for political or economic gain. Then came the Romans, and with them, the first whispers of something darker. The Roman Empire, at its height, stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara. It was a machine of conquest, administration, and commerce on a scale the world had never seen. And opium, which had been a regional medicine for thousands of years, was about to become something else entirely, an international commodity, a luxury good, and for the first time in recorded history, a source of pleasure that had nothing to do with pain relief. Roman physicians inherited the knowledge of the Greeks and expanded upon it with characteristic ambition. None was more influential than Galen of Pergamon, who lived from 130 to 210 CE. Galen was a personal physician to Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-king who ruled Rome during some of its most turbulent years. Galen was a prolific writer, a brilliant anatomist, and an innovator in pharmacology. He took the opium preparations of Greeks and refined them into something far more complex. His most famous creation was theriac, sometimes called Venice treacle in later centuries. It was an opium-based cure-all that contained more than 60 ingredients, including viper flesh, cinnamon, myrrh, and various herbs and spices. The preparation process took weeks. It was expensive, elaborate, and reserved for the wealthy and powerful. Theriac was prescribed for everything from snake bites to plague, from indigestion to melancholy. Whether it actually worked for most of these ailments is debatable, but the opium content certainly made patients feel better, at least temporarily. There is historical debate about whether Marcus Aurelius himself became dependent on opium. He suffered from chronic stomach pain and insomnia, conditions for which Galen prescribed opium regularly. Some scholars suggest that the emperor's later writings, increasingly detached and melancholic, reflect the mental fog of long-term opium use. Others argue this is speculation. What is not in dispute is that opium was a regular part of the imperial court's medical practice, administered freely to those who could afford it. But something else was happening in Rome, something that had not been documented in earlier civilizations. The Roman elite began using opium recreationally. Opium-laced wine appeared at banquets, served alongside imported delicacies and rare spices. It was offered at gladiatorial games, at orgies, at private gatherings of the wealthy. This was not medicine. This was pleasure. This was indulgence. The line between therapeutic use and recreational use, which had remained mostly clear for millennia, began to blur. Opium was becoming fashionable among those who had no pain to relieve, no suffering to ease, only boredom and wealth and a desire for novel sensations. This shift was subtle, but it was significant. For the first time, opium was being consumed not because it was necessary, but because it was available and enjoyable. At the same time, the Roman Empire's vast trade networks were transforming opium into a truly international commodity. The Silk Road, that legendary network of trade routes connecting the Mediterranean world to Central Asia, India, and eventually China, carried opium alongside silk, spices, precious metals, and glassware. Roman demand for Eastern luxuries was insatiable, and Eastern merchants quickly learned that opium was a product worth carrying. It was valuable, relatively easy to transport in its dried resin form, and always in demand. Arab traders became the key middlemen in this commerce. They controlled the routes through Persia and the Arabian Peninsula, and they understood the value of what they were transporting. By approximately 400 CE, opium had reached China, carried by Arab and Persian merchants traveling the Silk Road. The Chinese initially used it as medicine, just as the Europeans had, but the seed of something much larger had been planted. A pattern was emerging, one that would repeat itself across continents and centuries. Opium followed trade routes. It followed armies. It followed empire. Wherever there was commerce, wherever there was conquest, opium appeared. It was no longer simply a plant growing in fields near ancient cities. It was a commodity with economic value, a product that could be bought, sold, taxed, and controlled. Medicine was becoming pleasure. Necessity was becoming commodity. And commodity, in time, would become control. The Romans did not create an opium crisis in the way later empires would. Their use, even their recreational use, remained relatively contained, largely confined to the wealthy classes who could afford imported luxuries. But they established the infrastructure. They normalized the trade. They demonstrated that opium could be more than medicine, that it could be transformed into something that served not the patient's needs, but the merchant's profits and the empire's ambitions. While Europe descended into darkness, the Islamic Golden Age elevated opium to an art form. While Europe descended into darkness, the Islamic Golden Age elevated opium to an art form. From the 9th to the 13th centuries, while much of Europe struggled through the chaos of the early medieval period, the Islamic world experienced an explosion of scientific and medical advancement. Scholars in Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus, and Cordoba translated the works of the ancient Greeks and Romans, preserved them, debated them, and ultimately surpassed them. And nowhere was this more evident than in the field of medicine. The towering figure of this era was a Persian physician and philosopher named Abu Ali al-Husayn ibn Abd Allah ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna. Born in 980 CE near Bokhara in present-day Uzbekistan, Ibn Sina was a polymath of extraordinary genius. By age 18, he had mastered medicine, philosophy, mathematics, and astronomy. His masterwork, Al-Canon fi al-Tib, the Canon of Medicine, completed around 1025 CE, would become the standard medical textbook not just in the Islamic world, but eventually in Europe as well, remaining in use for more than 600 years. The canon is encyclopedic in scope, covering anatomy, pathology, pharmacology, and treatment protocols for hundreds of conditions, and opium features prominently throughout its pages. Ibn Sina understood opium with a clarity that would not be matched in Europe for centuries. He documented precise dosing guidelines, methods of preparation, optimal timing of administration. He described how opium could be formed into pills, dissolved into syrups, mixed with other medicines to enhance or moderate its effects. He recognized that individual patients responded differently to the same dose, and that careful observation was required to find the right balance. But Ibn Sina also issued warnings, clear, direct warnings about dependency. He wrote that prolonged use of opium created a need for the substance itself, that patients would suffer if it was suddenly withdrawn, that tolerance developed over time requiring ever-increasing doses. This was not moral judgment. This was clinical observation, recorded with scientific precision 1,000 years ago. Persian and Arab apothecaries, working in sophisticated pharmacy shops across the Islamic world, refined opium into standardized preparations. They created pills of consistent potency, syrups with measured concentrations, compounds that combined opium with other medicinal ingredients according to carefully tested formulas. This was pharmaceutical science in its infancy, and it was taking place in Baghdad and Cairo, while Europe was still centuries away from anything comparable. Yet there was tension beneath this scientific sophistication. Islamic law, derived from the Quran and the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, explicitly prohibited intoxication. Alcohol was forbidden. The alteration of consciousness for pleasure was considered sinful. So how could opium, which clearly altered consciousness, be permissible? Theological scholars debated this question extensively. The consensus that emerged was pragmatic and nuanced. Opium used for legitimate medical purposes, administered by physicians to relieve suffering, was permissible and even encouraged as an act of mercy. But opium used recreationally, consumed for pleasure or escape rather than healing, was condemned as a violation of religious law. The intention mattered. The context mattered. Medicine was permitted. Intoxication was not. This distinction reveals something crucial. Islamic scholars of the Golden Age recognized what would later be forgotten or deliberately obscured, that opium had a dual nature. It was both medicine and poison. It was both relief and dependency. It could heal or it could harm, depending on how it was used and why. This was not superstition or moralism. This was sophisticated pharmacological understanding, grounded in observation and refined over generations. While Europe struggled through its dark ages, Islamic physicians were advancing the science of medicine in ways that would not be equaled in the West for half a millennium. They preserved the knowledge of the ancients, tested it, expanded it, and systematized it into a coherent body of medical wisdom. When Europe finally awakened, it inherited this knowledge and twisted it toward darker purposes. The 16th century marked Europe's emergence from a medieval period into what historians would later call the Renaissance. Ancient texts, preserved and expanded upon by Islamic scholars during Europe's long intellectual darkness, began flowing back into European universities through trade routes and the aftermath of the Crusades. Greek and Roman medical knowledge, refined by centuries of Persian and Arab innovation, was being rediscovered, and with it came opium. Into this ferment of rediscovery stepped a figure both brilliant and controversial, a man who would change the course of Western medicine and set opium on a path toward ubiquity. His name was Philippus Aurelius Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, though he is known to history by the name he chose for himself, Paracelsus. Born in 1493 in Switzerland, Paracelsus was a radical. He rejected the medical orthodoxy of his time, which still relied heavily on ancient authorities like Galen without question or experimentation. Paracelsus believed in observation, in testing, in challenging accepted wisdom. He traveled extensively, learning from folk healers, miners, and alchemists as readily as from university physicians. And somewhere in his studies, he encountered opium and saw in it something transformative. Around 1527, Paracelsus created a preparation he called laudanum. The formula was elegantly simple: opium resin dissolved in high-proof alcohol. The alcohol served multiple purposes. It extracted the opium's alkaloids efficiently, making the preparation more potent. It preserved the mixture, giving it a long shelf life. And it made dosing more precise, as drops could be measured and administered consistently. This was opium transformed into a portable, stable, concentrated medicine that could travel anywhere and keep indefinitely. Paracelsus promoted laudanum with evangelical fervor. He called it the stone of immortality. He claimed it could cure everything from pain and insomnia to plague and melancholy. He wrote that he possessed a secret remedy that surpassed all others, and while he never revealed his exact formula during his lifetime, laudanum's reputation spread rapidly through medical circles. After his death in 1541, various physicians claimed to have recreated or improved upon his formula, and by the early 1600s, laudanum had become a standard feature of European pharmacies. This was seen as progress, scientific progress, medical progress. Opium had been refined, standardized, and made universally available. Every physician could prescribe it. Every apothecary could dispense it. Every household could keep a bottle on hand for emergencies. It was the aspirin of its age, the go-to remedy for countless ailments. But something else was happening simultaneously, something that would prove far more consequential than laudanum's medical applications. European powers were expanding globally. Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, and British ships were establishing trade routes and colonies across Africa, Asia, and the Americas. And these colonizers brought opium with them. The Portuguese, who established trading posts in India and China in the early 1500s, introduced opium to new markets. They observed that in China, where tobacco smoking had recently been introduced from the Americas, some people had begun mixing tobacco with opium. This innovation, smoking rather than eating opium, would prove catastrophic, but that realization lay centuries in the future. British and Dutch traders, recognizing opium's value as a commodity, began encouraging its cultivation in their colonial territories, particularly in India. The climate was ideal. The labor was cheap and controlled. The profit margins were substantial. What had been a Mediterranean crop grown in small quantities for local medical use was being transformed into a plantation product, grown at industrial scale for export and profit. The logic of empire was taking hold. Opium was no longer primarily medicine. It was becoming a commodity, a product to be cultivated, traded, and taxed. The poppy fields of Bengal were being planted not to serve the medical needs of local populations, but to generate revenue for trading companies and colonial governments. The medicinal plant was being weaponized, though few recognized it at the time. Laudanum bottles sat on shelves in London and Paris and Amsterdam. Opium plantations expanded across India. Portuguese merchants carried the drug to Chinese ports. The infrastructure of what would become the global opium trade was being constructed, piece by piece, under the banner of medicine and commerce and progress. But it was in the East, in China, where opium would cease being medicine and become a weapon of empire. Opium arrived in China sometime around the 7th century CE, carried along the Silk Road by Arab and Persian traders. The Chinese called it Afuyang, the foreign medicine, and they treated it exactly as that, medicine. It was used sparingly, primarily for treating dysentery and pain, prescribed by physicians in small, controlled doses. For nearly 1,000 years, opium remained a minor footnote in Chinese pharmacology, one remedy among thousands in a medical tradition far older and more sophisticated than anything Europe possessed at the time. Then came tobacco. In the 17th century, Portuguese and Dutch traders introduced tobacco smoking to China, a practice they had encountered in the Americas. Smoking was a novelty, a new way of consuming substances that caught on rapidly, especially in the coastal trading cities where foreign merchants congregated. And someone, at some point whose name is lost to history, had an idea. If tobacco could be smoked, why not mix it with opium? The combination produced a more powerful effect than either substance alone. The opium's euphoria combined with tobacco's stimulation created something compelling, something that spread to the port cities of southern China like a slow-burning fire. By the early 1700s, some users had dispensed with the tobacco entirely and were smoking pure opium. The method was ritualized, almost ceremonial. The opium was heated over a flame until it liquefied. Then the vapor was inhaled through a long pipe. Unlike eating opium, which produced effects gradually over hours, smoking delivered the drug directly to the bloodstream through the lungs. The onset was immediate, the high was intense, and the addiction, when it took hold, was profound. This was not medicine anymore. This was something else entirely. The transformation from therapeutic use to recreational use, from eating to smoking, changed everything about opium's social role in China. What had been a physician's tool became a pleasure-seeking activity. Opium dens began appearing in cities along the coast, Canton, Amoy, Ningbo, dark rooms filled with smoke where men reclined on wooden platforms, pipes in hand, lost in opium dreams. The practice spread inland, moving up rivers and along trade routes, from coastal elites to urban workers to rural peasants. The Qing government watched this development with growing alarm. In 1729, Emperor Yongjung issued the first imperial edict against opium smoking. It was not a complete prohibition. Medicinal use remained legal, but smoking opium recreationally was now officially banned. The edict had little effect. The trade continued. The dens remained open. The number of users kept growing. And an ocean away, the British East India Company was paying attention. Britain had a problem. The British appetite for Chinese goods, tea, silk, porcelain, was insatiable and growing. But China was largely self-sufficient and had little interest in British-manufactured goods. The Chinese emperor had made this clear. China had everything it needed. Trade would continue, but only if the British paid in silver. The result was a massive trade imbalance. Silver flowed out of Britain and into China, year after year, draining British coffers and enriching Chinese merchants and the imperial treasury. The East India Company, which held a monopoly on British trade with Asia, needed a product the Chinese wanted, something they would pay for, something that would reverse the flow of silver. They found it in opium. The company controlled vast territories in India, including the opium-producing regions of Bengal and Bihar. The climate was perfect. The labor was controlled. The profits were extraordinary. The company began systematically expanding opium cultivation, not for medicine, not for the benefit of Indian or Chinese populations, but for one purpose: to create a product they could sell to China in exchange for the silver they needed to buy tea. The logic was coldly mercantile. Grow opium in India, ship it to China, sell it for silver, use that silver to buy tea, ship the tea to Britain, sell it for pounds sterling. The triangular trade was elegant in its simplicity and catastrophic in its consequences. By the 1820s and 1830s, the British East India Company was smuggling more than 1,000 tons of opium per year into China, operating through private merchants and corrupt Chinese officials. The Chinese government's prohibition meant nothing. The profits were too high. The demand was too strong. And the British government, far from restraining the company, actively supported the trade. This was not a rogue corporation acting against national interests. This was official British policy. The drug trade was financing the empire. China was being systematically flooded with a narcotic substance by a foreign power for the explicit purpose of economic exploitation. Millions of Chinese citizens were becoming addicted. Silver was hemorrhaging out of the country. Social structures were beginning to collapse. Families were being destroyed. And the Chinese government, confronting a crisis of addiction and economic devastation, found itself powerless to stop it. The inevitability of what came next hangs over this period like a dark cloud. The collision was not a matter of if, but when. China would try to defend itself. Britain would respond with force. And the result would be wars fought, explicitly and unambiguously, to protect the right to sell drugs. What happened next would become the most shameful chapter in the history of empire. By the 1830s, the British East India Company had become the largest drug trafficking organization the world had ever seen. Not metaphorically, literally. The company was smuggling more than 1,400 tons of opium into China every year, operating through a network of private merchants, corrupt officials, and armed ships. This was not a rogue operation. This was official British policy, explicitly supported by the government in London, designed to extract wealth from China and correct the trade imbalance that threatened British economic interests. The consequences for China were catastrophic. By conservative estimates, more than 10% of the Chinese population had become addicted to opium. In the coastal provinces, the figure was higher, perhaps 20 or 30% in some cities. This was not a marginal problem, affecting a small subculture. This was a national crisis. Entire families were being destroyed. Productive members of society, farmers, craftsmen, merchants, soldiers, even government officials, were losing themselves to the drug. The economy was hemorrhaging silver at an unsustainable rate, reversing centuries of accumulated wealth. Social order was beginning to collapse. The Chinese government, confronting an existential threat, appointed a scholar official named Lin Zexu as imperial commissioner with extraordinary powers to end the opium trade. Lin was a man of principle, educated in the Confucian tradition, deeply committed to the welfare of the Chinese people. He arrived in Canton, the center of the foreign trade, in March 1839. What he found appalled him. Warehouses full of opium, merchants openly dealing in poison, foreign traders living in luxury while Chinese citizens suffered and died. Lin Zexu wrote a letter to Queen Victoria. It is one of the most remarkable documents of the 19th century, a moral indictment delivered with clarity and restraint. He wrote, "Where is your conscience? I have heard that smoking opium is strictly forbidden in your own country, indicating that you are aware of its harmfulness. Since you do not permit it to injure your own country, you ought not to have the injurious drug transferred to another country." He asked a simple question: why would Britain prohibit something at home while forcing it upon China? He received no reply. In June 1839, Lin Zexu acted. He blockaded the foreign factories, demanding that all opium be surrendered. Over several weeks, British merchants handed over approximately 20,000 chests of opium, more than 1,400 tons. Lin did not confiscate it for government use or sell it. He destroyed it, publicly. He had trenches dug near the harbor, mixed the opium with lime and salt water, and flushed it into the sea. The destruction took 23 days. It was not an act of aggression. It was an act of self-defense, a sovereign nation trying to protect its people from a drug epidemic deliberately inflicted by a foreign power. Britain's response was war. Let's be clear about what this means. The British government, the most powerful empire on earth at that time, declared war on China because China had destroyed British-owned opium. The justification offered was free trade. The British insisted they had the right to sell whatever products they wished, wherever they wished, and any interference with that trade was grounds for military action. The word opium was rarely used in official British communications. They spoke instead of property rights and commercial interests. But everyone knew what this war was about. The First Opium War lasted from 1839 to 1842. It was not a contest. Britain deployed modern steam-powered warships against Chinese junks. British artillery outranged Chinese cannon by vast distances. British troops carried rifles, while many Chinese soldiers still used matchlocks and spears. The war was a slaughter. British ships sailed up the Yangtze River, blockaded ports, bombarded coastal cities, and systematically destroyed Chinese defensive positions. The Qing dynasty, for all its size and population, could not defend itself against the technology of industrial warfare. In August 1842, China surrendered. The Treaty of Nanking, signed aboard a British warship, dictated the terms. China was forced to pay an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars, compensation for the destroyed opium and the cost of the war. China was forced to cede the island of Hong Kong to Britain in perpetuity. China was forced to open 5 ports to British trade, with British citizens subject to British law, not Chinese law. And critically, though not explicitly stated in the treaty itself, the opium trade would continue unimpeded. But the humiliation was not complete. In 1856, using a minor incident involving a British flagship as pretext, Britain launched a second Opium War. This time, France joined as an ally, seeking its own commercial advantages. The Anglo-French forces invaded northern China, pushing toward Beijing itself. In October 1860, British and French troops entered the Old Summer Palace, the Yuan Mingyuan, a complex of palaces and gardens built over 150 years, filled with priceless artifacts, paintings, manuscripts, and treasures representing the pinnacle of Chinese artistic achievement. They looted it, then they burned it to the ground. The destruction took 3 days. It was deliberate, calculated cultural annihilation, ordered by the British High Commissioner Lord Elgin as punishment for Chinese resistance. Historian Victor Hugo, writing from France, called a crime committed by 2 bandits against civilization itself. The Treaty of Tientsin, forced upon China in 1860, completed the subjugation. Opium was now explicitly legalized. Christianity had to be permitted throughout China. More ports were opened. More territory was ceded. The British and French had won everything they wanted. The drug trade that China had tried to ban in 1729, that Commissioner Lin had tried to end in 1839, was now protected by treaty, enforced by gunboats. The human cost is almost incomprehensible. By the end of the 19th century, an estimated 40 million Chinese citizens, roughly 10% of the population, were addicted to opium. Life expectancy dropped. Birth rates declined. Entire regions experienced economic collapse. The social fabric of Chinese civilization, one of the oldest and most sophisticated on Earth, was being torn apart by a drug epidemic imposed and maintained by foreign powers for profit. Britain never called it a drug war. They called it free trade. They called it the defense of British interests. They framed China as backward, unreasonable, hostile to commerce. The moral obscenity of the situation was buried under layers of imperial rhetoric and racist assumptions about Chinese inferiority. But the facts are undeniable. The British Empire went to war twice to protect its right to traffic narcotics into another country. It used its military to force a sovereign nation to accept the mass poisoning of its population. It destroyed cultural treasures and killed tens of thousands of people in order to maintain a drug monopoly. This is not a controversial historical interpretation. This is documented fact. The Opium Wars are named after the drug. The cause was never in question. The British government knew exactly what it was doing, and it did it anyway, because the profits were too substantial and the Chinese were too weak to stop them. The poppy had become a weapon, and the weapon had been used to subjugate a civilization. While China burned, opium was quietly conquering the West, not through war, but through medicine bottles. In 19th century Britain and America, opium was everywhere, in every pharmacy, every grocery store, available from traveling medicine wagons that rolled through rural towns selling miracle cures. It was completely legal, utterly unregulated, and morally acceptable. Laudanum sat in kitchen cupboards next to flour and tea. Patent medicines with names like Godfrey's Cordial, Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, and McMunn's Elixir lined the shelves of respectable homes. Each contained substantial amount of opium, often combined with alcohol, sometimes with other ingredients, always marketed as safe and beneficial. Doctors prescribed opium for nearly everything. Pain, certainly, but also coughs, diarrhea, insomnia, anxiety, menstrual cramps, morning sickness, tuberculosis, cholera, women's troubles, a euphemism for any female complaint that made male physicians uncomfortable. The Victorian medical establishment had an opium preparation for every ailment, real or imagined, and patients took it faithfully because their doctors told them to. Picture a typical middle-class Victorian household. The mother, exhausted by the demands of managing a home and raising children, takes a spoonful of laudanum for her nerves or her monthly discomfort, or simply the vague malaise that Victorian physicians diagnosed as hysteria. She gives her teething infant a few drops of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, which contains morphine sulfate along with alcohol. The baby stops crying, stops moving really, falls into a deep, narcotic sleep. The father, perhaps a veteran of the Crimean War or the American Civil War, takes opium pills for the chronic pain from old injuries. This was not considered a problem. This was modern medicine. Infant mortality rates in working-class neighborhoods where these soothing syrups were most heavily used were catastrophic, though the connection was rarely acknowledged. Babies given opium-laced teething remedies sometimes simply stopped breathing. They died quietly in their sleep, and it was called natural causes or weak constitution. The patent medicine industry continued advertising their products as safe for infants. The literary and artistic classes of Victorian England had their own relationship with opium, one that was romanticized and public. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, one of England's greatest poets, was dependent on laudanum for most of his adult life. He claimed to have written his famous poem Kubla Khan in an opium-induced dream, though he left it unfinished, interrupted, or so he said, by a visitor from Porlock. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, one of the most celebrated poets of her generation, took laudanum daily for decades, prescribed originally for a spinal injury. Thomas de Quincey wrote Confessions of an English Opium Eater in 1821, a memoir that described both the pleasures and horrors of opium addiction with remarkable honesty. The book became a bestseller. Wilkie Collins, author of The Woman in White and The Moonstone, was addicted to laudanum, often taking astonishing doses to manage chronic pain. These were not marginalized figures hiding shameful secrets. They were celebrated members of respectable society. Their opium use was known, discussed in literary circles, even viewed with a certain fascination. There was no stigma, no moral panic, no calls for prohibition. But the working class, as always, experienced opium differently. Factory workers in Manchester and Birmingham, laboring 14-hour shifts in brutal conditions for poverty wages, took Godfrey's cordial not for pleasure, but for survival. It dulled the pain of industrial accidents and chronic injuries that would never receive proper medical treatment. It made the unbearable slightly more bearable. Children as young as 8 or 9, working in textile mills and coal mines, were given opium-laced preparations to keep them awake during long shifts or to help them sleep in the few hours between. This was not recreation. This was the cost of industrialization, paid in human suffering and medicated with opium. The irony is almost unbearable. The same British Empire that was at that very moment devastating China with opium, fighting wars to protect drug trafficking, had an opium epidemic at home of comparable scale. But it was invisible because it was legal. It was medicalized. It was wrapped in the language of treatment and relief rather than vice and intoxication. And critically, it was associated with white middle-class and upper-class users, respectable people taking medicine, not degenerate addicts seeking pleasure. The hypocrisy runs deeper still. British politicians and merchants justified the China trade by claiming they were merely providing a product that Chinese customers wanted. They framed Chinese opposition as unreasonable interference with free commerce. They never acknowledged that millions of British citizens were equally dependent on the same substance. The difference was not the drug. The difference was that in Britain, opium use was controlled through medical and commercial systems that preserved social order and generated profit for British companies, while in China, it was destabilizing an entire civilization. Victorian society could not see, or would not see, that the medicine cabinet was full of the same poison they were selling to China. The bottles had different labels. The context was different. but the alkaloids were identical, and the addiction was just as real. It was simply more respectable when it came in a small brown bottle prescribed by a doctor, rather than smoked in an opium den. By the late 1800s, some physicians were beginning to recognize the scale of the problem. Medical journals published articles about opium dependency, about patients who could not stop taking their medicine, about the subtle signs of addiction masquerading as treatment. But reform would be slow, fought against by the patent medicine industry, and by a medical profession that had built entire treatment protocols around opium. The flower had conquered Europe and America as completely as it had China. The method was different. The outcome was the same. But science was about to isolate the flower's deadliest secret. In 1804, a young German pharmacist apprentice named Friedrich Turner, working in his spare time in a makeshift laboratory, accomplished something that had never been done before in the history of chemistry. He isolated the active ingredient of opium. Using a process of repeated acid-base extractions, he separated out a crystalline substance that contained all of opium's pain-relieving properties in concentrated form. He tested it on himself, on stray dogs, on 3 teenage boys who volunteered as subjects. The substance produced profound sleep, dramatic pain relief, and in higher doses, respiratory depression that could be fatal. Sir Turner named his discovery morphine after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. It was the first alkaloid ever extracted from a plant, a breakthrough that would revolutionize both medicine and chemistry. Here was opium purified, standardized, scientifically understood. No more guessing about potency, no more variability between batches. Morphine could be measured precisely, administered in exact doses, relied upon to produce consistent effects. The medical establishment embraced morphine as a miracle. This was a 19th century ideal, rational, scientific, pure. Doctors could now prescribe specific amounts rather than crude opium preparations that varied wildly in strength. Morphine was roughly 10 times more potent than raw opium by weight, which meant smaller doses could achieve greater effects. It seemed like progress. Then, in 1853, came another breakthrough, the hypodermic needle, invented independently by Alexander Wood in Scotland and Charles Gabriel Pervaz in France. The syringe allowed morphine to be injected directly into the bloodstream. The effect was immediate, powerful, and unlike anything oral opium could achieve. Pain vanished within seconds. The relief was total. For surgery, for traumatic injuries, for terminal illness, injectable morphine was genuinely revolutionary. It was also immediately addictive in ways that eating opium had never been. The American Civil War, which raged from 1861 to 1865, became a proving ground for morphine's capabilities and its dangers. Battlefield surgeons carried morphine sulfate in their medical kits. Wounded soldiers received injections freely, often multiple times per day for weeks or months during recovery. The drug made amputations bearable, allowed men with catastrophic injuries to endure transport to field hospitals, provided the only mercy available in an age before antibiotics or advanced trauma care. But when the war ended and the soldiers returned home, more than 100,000 Union veterans came back addicted to morphine. It was so common it acquired a euphemism, army disease, or soldier's disease. These men had not chosen recreational drug use. They had received medicine, administered by doctors for legitimate wounds. And now they were dependent, suffering through withdrawal if they tried to stop, forced to seek continued prescriptions or turn to the black market that was beginning to emerge. The same pattern was evident in Europe after the Franco-Prussian War and other conflicts. Wherever modern warfare met injectable morphine, addiction followed. The lesson should have been clear. Purification and more efficient delivery did not make opioids safer. It made them more dangerous. Instead, chemists kept searching for a better version. In 1874, a British chemist named C.R. Alderwright, working at St. Mary's Hospital Medical School in London, was experimenting with morphine derivatives. He boiled morphine with acetic anhydride and created a new compound, diacetylmorphine. He tested it on dogs. The substance was clearly more potent than morphine, producing faster onset and more intense respiratory depression. Wright wrote up his findings and moved on to other projects. The discovery sat in medical literature for 23 years, largely ignored. Then Bayer Pharmaceutical, the German chemical and drug company, rediscovered it. In 1897, Bayer chemist Felix Hoffmann synthesized diacetylmorphine as part of a research program looking for effective cough suppressants and pain relievers. The company tested it extensively and found it worked remarkably well for coughs, perhaps because it suppressed the respiratory system so effectively. They also noticed it produced a stronger euphoria than morphine, which they interpreted as a positive quality. Patients felt better, more energetic, more capable. They called it heroin, from the German word heroisch, meaning heroic, powerful, strong. Bayer began marketing heroin in 1898 as an over-the-counter cough remedy. It was sold in bottles and tablets as a powder. Advertisements featured children. Promotional materials claimed heroin was safer than morphine, non-addictive, and suitable for treating morphine addiction. Doctors were encouraged to prescribe it for coughs, colds, bronchitis, tuberculosis, and as a substitute for patients dependent on morphine. Every single one of these claims was catastrophically false. Heroin is approximately 2 to 3 times more potent than morphine. It crosses the blood-brain barrier more rapidly, producing a faster and more intense high. It is extraordinarily addictive, more so than morphine, more so than opium, and prescribing it to morphine addicts did not cure them. It simply transferred their dependency to a more dangerous substance. Within a decade, the problems became impossible to ignore. Reports of heroin addiction began appearing in medical journals. Doctors noted that patients prescribed heroin for coughs were returning for more prescriptions far longer than any cough could last. Cases of overdose and death multiplied. The same population that had been dependent on morphine was now dependent on heroin, along with a new generation of users who had been given the drug for minor ailments. By 1913, Bayer quietly stopped producing heroin. No recall, no public acknowledgement of error, just a silent discontinuation. But the drug was already out in the world. Other pharmaceutical companies continued manufacturing it. Street chemists began producing it illicitly. The genie, as always, could not be put back in the bottle. The pattern is almost painful to observe. Opium caused addiction, so chemists created morphine. Morphine caused addiction, so chemists created heroin. Each iteration was supposed to be the solution to the previous problem. Each iteration was more potent, more addictive, more dangerous than what came before. The problem was never the impurities in crude opium. The problem was the alkaloids themselves, and concentrating them only concentrated the harm. Science had given humanity the power to isolate and intensify nature's chemistry, but it had not given us the wisdom to understand what we were unleashing, or the humility to admit when we had made things worse. As the 20th century dawned, America finally began to see opium not as medicine, but as menace, and the reason had everything to do with race. In the decades following the California gold rush, Chinese immigrants came to America by the tens of thousands. They came seeking opportunity, fleeing poverty and political upheaval in China, lured by promises of work. And work they did. Chinese laborers were essential to building the Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869. They blasted through the Sierra Nevada mountains with dynamite and hand tools, working in conditions that killed thousands. They worked in mines, in laundries, in agriculture, taking jobs that white Americans often refused. They were paid less than white workers for the same labor. They were denied citizenship, barred from owning property in many jurisdictions, subject to discriminatory taxes and violence. And they brought with them the practice of smoking opium. This is where the story takes a turn into naked hypocrisy. White Americans in the 1870s and 1880s were consuming opium in vast quantities. Laudanum was in every household. Morphine was administered freely by doctors. Patent medicines loaded with opiates lined pharmacy shelves. Middle-class white women were dependent on laudanum for their nerves. Civil War veterans were addicted to morphine. This was accepted. This was normal. This was medicine. But when Chinese immigrants smoked opium in the privacy of their own communities, it became a moral crisis. The opium den, a room where Chinese men reclined on mats and smoked opium through long pipes, became the focal point of American racial anxiety. Never mind that the opium dens were largely confined to Chinatowns, frequented almost exclusively by Chinese laborers seeking a few hours of relief from backbreaking work and systematic discrimination. Never mind that white Americans were consuming far more opium overall through their laudanum and morphine habits. The opium den was visible, foreign, associated with Chinese culture, and that made it dangerous. The propaganda was explicit and vicious. Newspaper articles and political cartoons depicted Chinese men as sinister figures luring innocent white women into opium dens for purposes of seduction and moral corruption. The specter of the Chinese opium den as a site where white women would be ruined by opium and sexual contact with Chinese men became a recurring theme in media and political discourse. This was the Yellow Peril narrative, the racist fear that Asian immigration threatened white racial purity and American civilization. The opium den was merely the most convenient symbol. In 1875, San Francisco passed the first anti-opium law in America, but the ordinance was surgical in its discrimination. It banned opium smoking. Not opium, not laudanum, not morphine, only the practice of smoking opium, which was the Chinese method of consumption. White Americans could continue purchasing opium-laced medicines from any pharmacy without legal consequence. Chinese immigrants smoking opium in their own communities were now criminals. Let's be absolutely clear about what this was. This was the same drug, the same alkaloids, the same addictive properties, the same potential for harm. The only difference was who was using it and how. And the law was written specifically to criminalize the Chinese while protecting white consumption. This was not public health policy. This was racial control dressed up as drug prohibition. The pattern established in San Francisco spread. Other cities passed similar ordinances. The laws were selectively enforced, used as justification to raid Chinese neighborhoods, arrest Chinese men, and reinforce the social and legal marginalization of Chinese immigrants. White opiate users were patients. Chinese opiate users were criminals. Same drug, different laws. In 1909, the federal government passed the Smoking Opium Exclusion Act, which banned the importation, possession, and smoking of opium prepared for smoking. Once again, the law targeted the Chinese method specifically. Medicinal opium remained completely legal. Laudanum, morphine, heroin, all of it could still be purchased over the counter. But if you smoked opium, you were a criminal. Then came 1914 and the Harrison Narcotics Act, the law that would fundamentally reshape American drug policy and create the foundation for everything that followed. On its face, the Harrison Act was merely a tax law, requiring anyone who produced, distributed, or dispensed opiates or cocaine to register with the federal government and pay a tax. But the language included a provision that these drugs could only be distributed in the course of professional practice by registered physicians. That phrase, in the course of professional practice, became the weapon. Federal authorities interpreted this to mean that doctors could prescribe opiates for acute medical conditions, but not for addiction maintenance. If a patient was dependent on morphine or heroin, prescribing those drugs to prevent withdrawal was not legitimate medical practice. According to the government, it was enabling addiction. Doctors who continued to prescribe opiates to dependent patients were arrested, tried, and imprisoned. The Supreme Court initially upheld these prosecutions. Maintenance treatment, which had been standard medical practice for managing opioid dependence, was now a federal crime. Overnight, approximately 100,000 Americans who had been receiving legal prescriptions for opiates from their doctors became criminals if they sought to continue their medication. These were not street addicts seeking a high. These were patients, Civil War veterans, middle-aged women prescribed laudanum for decades, chronic pain sufferers, who were medically dependent on opiates and had been managing their conditions under physician supervision. The Harrison Act did not cure them. It criminalized them. The medical profession was split. Some physicians supported the law, believing addiction was a moral failing that required punishment, not treatment. Others recognized the catastrophe unfolding, arguing that cutting off patients from legal supplies would drive them to the black market, increasing both suffering and crime. They were correct. The black market exploded. Criminal organizations, seeing opportunity in prohibition, began importing and distributing illegal opiates. Users who had been stable for years descended into the chaos of street drug use. Overdoses increased. Crime increased. Suffering increased. This is the original sin of American drug prohibition. The Harrison Act was not designed to protect public health. It was designed to control populations. Chinese immigrants, Black Americans, Mexican immigrants, who were increasingly associated with specific drugs. Opium was Chinese. Cocaine was Black. Marijuana would soon be Mexican. And the laws were written and enforced accordingly. The lesson is uncomfortable but undeniable. Drug prohibition in America was born from xenophobia, racism, and the desire to control marginalized populations. The public health justifications came later, retrofitted onto a framework built for discrimination. The pattern established in 1875 in San Francisco, same drug, different users, different laws, has repeated itself for more than a century. Prohibition created a monster that makes the Opium Wars look quaint. The Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914 and subsequent prohibition laws did not eliminate opium or heroin from America. They simply transferred control from doctors and pharmacists to criminals. Within a decade, organized crime recognized the extraordinary profit potential of a product that was cheap to produce, easy to transport, highly addictive, and artificially scarce due to legal prohibition. The black market that emerged in the 1920s would evolve over the next century into a global industry worth hundreds of billions of dollars, leaving a trail of addiction, violence, and geopolitical catastrophe in its wake. In the 1920s through 1950s, the Italian mafia controlled heroin distribution in major American cities. New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Detroit, each had networks importing heroin, primarily from Europe, and distributing it through urban neighborhoods. The mafia understood prohibition's fundamental economic truth. Artificial scarcity creates immense profit margins. They could buy heroin for a few dollars per dose and sell it for 50 times that amount. The profits financed their entire criminal empire. After World War II, a more sophisticated operation emerged: the French Connection. Turkish farmers grew opium poppies legally for legitimate pharmaceutical companies, but significant quantities were diverted to criminal networks. The raw opium was smuggled to Marseille, France, where Corsican gangsters operated clandestine laboratories that refined it into high-purity heroin. The heroin was then smuggled into the United States, primarily through New York City, hidden in commercial cargo, automobile parts, furniture, anything that could cross international borders. This operation flourished from the 1930s until 1972, when a coordinated international law enforcement effort finally disrupted the network. But shutting down one pipeline simply redirected the flow elsewhere. The Vietnam War era introduced a new source: the Golden Triangle, the region where Burma, Laos, and Thailand meet. This mountainous, remote area had cultivated opium for centuries, but during the Cold War, it became a geopolitical flashpoint. The CIA, seeking to counter communist influence in Southeast Asia, backed various anti-communist warlords and militias in the region. Many of these groups financed their operations by growing and trafficking opium. This is not conspiracy theory. This is documented historical fact, confirmed by declassified documents, journalistic investigations, and congressional testimony. The CIA turned a blind eye to and in some cases actively facilitated drug trafficking by its allies. American soldiers in Vietnam had easy access to cheap, pure heroin. Estimates suggest that by 1971, somewhere between 10 and 25% of American servicemen in Vietnam had used heroin. Thousands returned home addicted, creating a domestic crisis that terrified political leaders and the American public. President Richard Nixon, facing this crisis and seeking political advantage, declared a war on drugs in 1971. The rhetoric was about public health and saving lives. The reality, as admitted decades later by Nixon's domestic policy advisor John Ehrlichman in a 1994 interview, was about political control. Ehrlichman stated, "We knew we were lying about the drugs. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies: the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. This confession strips away any pretense. The war on drugs was a political weapon, not a public health initiative. Meanwhile, the global heroin trade continued adapting. In the 1980s, during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the Golden Crescent, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northwestern Iran, became the new center of opium production. Once again, geopolitics and drug trafficking intersected. The CIA supported Afghan mujahideen fighters, resisting the Soviet occupation, and many of these groups financed their operations through opium cultivation and heroin production. American weapons and money flowed to fighters who were simultaneously flooding the region with heroin. The pattern repeated itself with numbing predictability. American foreign policy priorities overrode drug enforcement concerns. Then came a remarkable development. In July 2000, Taliban leader Mullah Muhammad Omar issued a decree banning opium cultivation in Afghanistan. The ban was enforced ruthlessly. Farmers who violated it faced severe punishment. Within 1 year, opium production in Afghanistan dropped by approximately 90%, from 3,276 tons in 2000 to 185 tons in 2001. It was the most successful drug eradication campaign in modern history. It lasted less than a year. In October 2001, following the September 11 attacks, the United States invaded Afghanistan. The Taliban regime collapsed within weeks, and opium production resumed almost immediately. By 2002, production had rebounded to 3,400 tons. By 2007, it reached 8,200 tons. Afghanistan became responsible for producing approximately 90% of the world's heroin supply, not despite the American military presence, but during it. For 20 years, while U.S. and NATO forces occupied Afghanistan, while billions of dollars were spent on counter-narcotics efforts, opium production reached the highest levels in recorded history. How is this possible? The answer is complex, but fundamentally about priorities and incentives. The U.S. military's primary mission was counterterrorism and stabilization, not drug enforcement. Disrupting opium production risked alienating rural populations and local power brokers whose cooperation was deemed necessary for military operations. Corruption was endemic at every level of the Afghan government, and the economic reality was stark. For Afghan farmers, opium was often 10 times more profitable than any legal crop. Prohibition created the price distortion that made opium irresistible. The pattern that emerged over the 20th century is undeniable. Legal prohibition does not eliminate drug production or use. It creates black markets. Black markets generate enormous profits. Those profits attract and finance criminal organizations, terrorist groups, and corrupt officials. Governments, pursuing other policy priorities, repeatedly find themselves tolerating or even facilitating drug trafficking by allies. The violence, addiction, and social destruction are not caused by the drugs themselves, but by the prohibition framework that transforms a public health issue into a criminal enterprise worth hundreds of billions of dollars annually. The poppy fields of Afghanistan, the heroin laboratories of Marseille, the distribution networks of the mafia, the CIA's Cold War compromises, these are not separate stories. They are chapters in the same story, the story of Prohibition's failure. Every attempt to eliminate supply through law enforcement simply reroutes the trade, often making it more violent and more profitable. The war on drugs did not reduce drug use. It militarized police forces, filled prisons, destabilized nations, and created the largest criminal industry in human history. And then, American doctors did what the British Empire did to China. In 1996, Purdue Pharma, a private pharmaceutical company controlled by the Sackler family, launched a new drug called OxyContin. It was an extended-release formulation of oxycodone, an opioid that had existed for decades. The innovation was the time-release mechanism, which was supposed to provide 12 hours of pain relief from a single dose. Purdue marketed OxyContin as a breakthrough in pain management, safe for long-term use, with minimal addiction risk. They claimed the extended-release formula made it less prone to abuse than immediate-release opioids. They told doctors the risk of addiction was less than 1%. Every word of this was a lie. Purdue trained an army of sales representatives and unleashed them on America with a specific strategy. They targeted regions with high rates of workplace injuries, chronic pain, and limited access to alternative pain management. Appalachia, the Rust Belt, rural communities across America where coal mining, manufacturing, and physical labor had left generations with broken bodies and few medical options. Sales reps visited doctors with free samples, promotional materials, and financial incentives. Doctors who prescribed high volumes of OxyContin were rewarded with speaking fees, consulting contracts, and paid trips to conferences. At the same time, Purdue and other pharmaceutical companies funded a campaign to change how American medicine thought about pain. They promoted the concept of pain as the fifth vital sign, something that should be assessed and treated as aggressively as blood pressure or heart rate. Medical organizations adopted this standard. Physicians were taught that undertreated pain was a failure of medical care, that opioids were safe and effective for chronic pain, that concerns about addiction were overblown and prevented patients from receiving necessary treatment. This was not accidental. This was a coordinated marketing campaign designed to overcome physician reluctance to prescribe opioids long-term. It worked devastatingly well. Between 1999 and 2010, the amount of prescription opioids dispensed in the United States quadrupled. Enough opioid pills were prescribed annually to keep every American adult medicated around the clock for a month. OxyContin became a blockbuster drug, generating billions in revenue for Purdue and the Sackler family. The Sacklers personally extracted more than $13 billion from the company over 2 decades, even as the evidence of catastrophic harm mounted. In certain regions, the saturation was total. Pill mills opened in Florida, West Virginia, and other states. Clinics that existed solely prescribed opioids to anyone willing to pay cash. Patients would drive hundreds of miles, wait in parking lots, see a doctor for 5 minutes, and leave with prescriptions for hundreds of pills. Pharmacies in small towns were dispensing millions of doses per year to populations of a few thousand people. The pills were everywhere, and then people became dependent. This was not a moral failure. This was pharmacology. Opioids are addictive. The human body develops tolerance, requiring higher doses to achieve the same effect. Physical dependence develops within weeks of regular use. When patients try to stop taking OxyContin, they experience withdrawal, sweating, nausea, bone pain, insomnia, profound anxiety. It was unbearable. So they kept taking the medication because their doctors told them it was safe, because they needed relief, because stopping was too painful. Then the prescriptions were cut off. As the addiction crisis became impossible to ignore, as overdose deaths began climbing, regulatory agencies and insurance companies imposed limits on opioid prescribing. Doctors who had been writing prescriptions freely for years suddenly stopped, often without tapering patients off the medication, without providing alternative pain management or addiction treatment. Patients who had been stable on prescribed opioids for months or years were told their prescriptions would not be renewed. No support, no plan, just withdrawal. These patients faced an impossible choice: suffer through withdrawal and unmanaged pain, or find opioids elsewhere. Many chose the black market, and the black market had heroin, which was cheaper than pills, more accessible, and often more potent. The transition from prescription opioids to heroin became a well-documented pathway. Study after study showed that people who became addicted to prescription opioids were 40 times more likely to use heroin than the general population. But heroin was just the next step in an escalating crisis. By the 2010s, a new threat emerged: fentanyl. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid originally developed for cancer pain and surgical anesthesia. It is approximately 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine. A dose the size of a few grains of salt can be lethal. Criminal organizations began manufacturing fentanyl in clandestine laboratories, primarily in China and Mexico, and mixing it into heroin supplies or pressing it into counterfeit pills designed to look like prescription opioids. Users often had no idea they were consuming fentanyl. The margin between an effective dose and a fatal dose is razor thin. Overdose deaths exploded. In the 1990s, approximately 10,000 Americans died annually from drug overdoses. By 2021, that number had reached 107,000, with roughly 75% of those deaths involving fentanyl or other synthetic opioids, the equivalent of a large airplane crashing every single day, killing everyone on board. The crisis devastated communities, particularly in regions where OxyContin had been most heavily marketed 2 decades earlier. Families destroyed, entire generations scarred, emergency rooms overwhelmed, morgues running out of space. Purdue Pharma finally faced legal consequences. In 2007, the company and 3 executives pleaded guilty to federal charges of misbranding OxyContin and lying about its addiction risks. They paid $634 million in fines. The executives received no jail time. The company continued selling OxyContin. In 2020, Purdue pleaded guilty again to criminal charges, including conspiracy to defraud the United States and violating anti-kickback laws. The company agreed to pay billions in fines and dissolved under bankruptcy proceedings. The Sackler family, facing thousands of lawsuits from states, cities, tribes, and individuals, agreed to pay approximately $4.5 billion over 9 years in exchange for legal immunity from future civil claims. They admitted no wrongdoing. None of them went to prison. The parallel to the Opium Wars is so precise it feels like historical poetry, except it is real and the bodies are still being counted. The British East India Company, backed by the British government, flooded China with opium for profit, creating an addiction epidemic that devastated Chinese society and destabilized an entire civilization. Purdue Pharma, backed by lax regulatory oversight and complicit medical institutions, flooded America with opioid for profit, creating an addiction epidemic that has killed hundreds of thousands and devastated American communities. Same mechanism, same motivations, same playbook, executed 150 years later on the country's own population. The flower remained the same. The chemistry remained the same. Only the delivery system and the marketing changed. Victorian laudanum became OxyContin. Morphine became fentanyl. Opium dens became pill mills, and then heroin houses, and then fentanyl lay supplies on the street. The human suffering remained constant. The profits remained extraordinary. And the people who profited faced little meaningful accountability. The opioid crisis is not over. Fentanyl continues to kill tens of thousands annually. New synthetic opioids, even more potent, are emerging. Communities are still reeling. Families are still grieving. And the pharmaceutical industry continues operating largely as it did before because the fundamental incentives have not changed. Profit over people, markets over lives. The same calculus that drove the British to war over opium drives the modern pharmaceutical industry's approach to drug development, marketing, and distribution. Today, the flower still blooms, and we are still burying the dead. In August 2021, after 20 years of military occupation, the United States withdrew from Afghanistan. The Taliban, which had been driven from power in 2001, returned to govern the country. Among their first declarations was a ban on opium cultivation, echoing the prohibition they had enforced in 2000 that had reduced production by 90%. Early reports suggested the ban was being implemented with the same ruthless efficiency. Poppy fields destroyed, farmers punished. But the effectiveness and longevity of this ban remains uncertain. The black market, as it always does, adapts. Opium production may decline in Afghanistan, may shift to other regions, may continue covertly. The pattern repeats. But in a bitter irony, Afghanistan's opium is increasingly relevant to the American opioid crisis. Heroin, derived from poppy fields, has been supplanted by something far more deadly and far easier to produce: fentanyl. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid created entirely in laboratories without requiring a single poppy plant. It was developed in 1959 by Dr. Paul Janssen as a surgical anesthetic and pain medication for cancer patients. Medically, in controlled settings, it serves a legitimate purpose. But outside those settings, fentanyl is a nightmare. It is approximately 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine and 50 times more potent than heroin. A dose of 2 milligrams, roughly the size of a few grains of salt, can be lethal. It is cheap to synthesize, easy to smuggle due to its potency requiring only tiny quantities, and extraordinarily profitable. Criminal organizations, primarily operating from labs in China and Mexico, began mass-producing fentanyl in the 2010s. They smuggle it across borders as powder or press it into counterfeit pills designed to look identical to legitimate prescription medications. Fake Percocet, fake Xanax, fake Adderall. Users seeking prescription pills on the black market have no way to know whether they are getting the drug they intended or a fentanyl-laced counterfeit that could kill them with a single dose. Fentanyl is also mixed into heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamine, often without the user's knowledge. People who have never used opioids, who are seeking stimulants or other drug entirely, are dying from fentanyl overdoses. The death toll is catastrophic and accelerating. In 2021, more than 107,000 Americans died from drug overdoses, with approximately 75% of those deaths involving synthetic opioids, primarily fentanyl. In 2022 and 2023, the numbers remain similarly devastating. This is not a crisis in the past tense. This is happening now, every day as you listen to this. There are interventions at work. Naloxone, sold under the brand name Narcan, is an opioid antagonist that can reverse an overdose within minutes if administered in time. Widespread distribution of naloxone to first responders, drug users, and community members has saved tens of thousands of lives. Safe injection sites, where people can use drugs under medical supervision with immediate access to overdose reversal, have proven effective in reducing overdose deaths in every country where they have been implemented. Medication-assisted treatment using methadone or buprenorphine allows people with opioid dependence to stabilize their lives, reduce cravings, and avoid the dangers of street drug use. These treatments are evidence-based, cost-effective, and humane. They are also underfunded and politically contentious. Opponents label harm reduction strategies as enabling addiction, arguing that making drug use safer encourages more people to use drugs. This has been disproven repeatedly by research, but the rhetoric persists. Safe injection sites face legal challenges and community opposition in most American cities. Medication-assisted treatment is restricted by regulations that limit which doctors can prescribe it and how many patients they can treat. Naloxone distribution, while expanding, still does not reach everyone who needs it. The political will to treat addiction as a public health crisis rather than a criminal justice problem remains inconsistent and insufficient. Meanwhile, thousands of people remain incarcerated for opioid-related offenses, possession charges, low-level dealing, crimes committed to fund addiction. Many are serving years or decades in prison for offenses involving substances that were, in many cases, originally prescribed to them legally. The Sackler family, whose company's deceptive marketing practices fueled the crisis, paid fines and retained billions in wealth. None of them went to prison. The contrast is obscene. The wars are not over. The war on drugs continues, militarized and effective, filling prisons while overdose deaths climb. The war in Afghanistan ended for American troops, but the geopolitical chaos and opium trade persist under different management. The war against pain, the marketing campaign that convinced doctors to prescribe opioids liberally, left millions dependent and then abandoned. These wars have not been won. They have not even been honestly confronted. They have simply mutated, shifted form, become more complex and more deadly. The poppy fields of Afghanistan may bloom or burn depending on Taliban enforcement and international pressure. But fentanyl does not need fields. It needs only chemists and smugglers in a market created by prohibition and untreated addiction. The crisis adapts faster than policy. The bodies accumulate faster than solutions. And the fundamental questions remain unanswered. So what is opium, really? After 6,000 years, the question remains. Papaver somniferum, the opium poppy. It grows still, in fields across the world, in gardens tended by people who know nothing of wars or empires or pharmaceutical companies. White and purple petals catch the morning sun. Seed pods swell and ripen. If you score the pod at the right moment, white latex bleeds from the wound, oxidizes to brown, concentrates into resin. The chemistry has not changed in 6 millennia. The plant has not evolved malice. It simply grows, photosynthesizes, reproduces, dies, and returns the following season. Indifferent, silent, without judgment. The flower knew no evil. We brought that for more than 5,000 years. Opium was simply medicine, relief from pain that would otherwise have been unendurable, mercy for the dying, sleep for the sleepless. It was harvested, prepared, administered by healers and physicians who understood its power and its dangers. It was integrated into medical practice across civilizations, from Sumeria to Egypt to Greece to Rome to Persia to China. It saved lives. It eased suffering. It was not perfect. Some became dependent, but it was treated as what it was, a powerful tool that required respect and caution. Then it became something else, a commodity, a source of profit, a tool of empire. The British East India Company did not flood China with opium because of pharmacology. They did it for money, to correct the trade imbalance, to extract wealth from a civilization they could not conquer by force alone. The flower was merely the delivery mechanism for economic domination. Purdue Pharma did not saturate America with OxyContin because of superior pain management. They did it for profit, to create a market, to capture revenue before patents expired. The flower was merely the substrate for synthesizing molecules they could sell. The drug was never the villain. The system that weaponized it was. This is a core lesson, the one that repeats across centuries and continents. When medicine becomes commodity, when relief becomes profit, when the imperative to ease suffering collides with the imperative to maximize shareholder value, catastrophe follows. Every time, without exception. The Opium Wars. Victorian laudanum epidemics while Chinese cities collapsed. The heroin marketed to children. The OxyContin crisis. Fentanyl pressed into counterfeit pills. The pattern is so consistent it feels almost predetermined, though it is not. It is a choice. A series of choices made by people and institutions prioritizing profit over human welfare. And yet, the flower itself retains its utility. In hospice care, opioids provide dignity at the end of life, allowing people to die without unbearable pain. In surgical wards, they make procedures tolerable that would otherwise be medieval torture. In trauma centers, they stabilize patients long enough for treatment. The alkaloids are not inherently evil. They are molecules that bind to receptors in the human nervous system and interrupt pain signals. Used appropriately, in controlled circumstances, with accountability and care, they remain one of medicine's most important tools. But we do not live in a world that prioritizes appropriate use and accountability. We live in a world where pharmaceutical companies can spend 2 decades lying about addiction risks and face no criminal prosecution for the executives responsible. We live in a world where prohibition creates black markets worth hundreds of billions of dollars, funding cartels and terrorist organizations. We live in a world where people sit in prison for possessing the same substance that made the Sackler family billionaires. The system is broken at every level, and the bodies accumulate as evidence of that failure. Can we learn from this? Can we build systems that honor the flower's gift without repeating the cycles of exploitation, addiction, and war? Can we separate the chemistry from the commerce, the medicine from the markets, the relief from the empire? These are not rhetorical questions. They have answers. Other countries have found better paths, systems that treat addiction as illness rather than crime, that regulate drugs as public health concerns rather than criminal enterprises. But those answers require political will, moral courage, and a willingness to confront the uncomfortable truth that the war on drugs and the profit-driven pharmaceutical industry have both failed catastrophically. Picture one last time a field of opium poppies at dawn. The light is soft. The air is still. White and purple petals sway gently. Someone walks through the rows with blade, scoring the unripe pods, watching the latex weep. The flower does not know it is controversial. It does not carry the weight of the Opium Wars, of Victorian addicts, of overdose deaths, of families destroyed. It simply grows. We carry that weight. We carry the history, the choices, the consequences. The flower simply blooms.